I believe at this time I have hypokalemic periodic paralysis and paramyotonia congenita.
Monica's situation is unique, as we know, and very unusual. What was unusual is that she had very severe muscle stiffness, right? That was the most common event and debilitating, and every once in a while associated with severe weakness. So one of these episodes, she was in the hospital and her potassium was low. So boom, recurrent weakness, low potassium, hypo-PP. Doctors get a lot more worried about a low potassium than a high potassium. Low potassium can cause irregularities of the heartbeat. They're going to jump on correcting a low potassium very quickly. They'll let you sit there. So for someone like Monica, I have recurrent weakness and they were all upset. The doctors were all in a tizzy because my potassium was low. I was really intrigued because multiple family members had similar scenario, and she had one of these unusual variants of unknown significance in the sodium channel. So we wanted to help her figure out, do the science, what's going on here. And when we studied her mutation in the laboratory, the channel didn't behave normally, but the way in which the abnormalities were manifest, it was much more similar to hyper-PP, not hypo. So that's where the science went. And as a clinician, she has severe myotonia. Well, myotonia and hypo-PP do not go together. In most people's minds, actually myotonia is an exclusionary criteria for hypo-PP.
There has been some findings in the research with Dr. Cannon, and what they have found is that it is a form of periodic paralysis, which I was not surprised. I was okay with whatever it ended up being. If it ended up being some other condition, it didn't matter what we called it, as long as I had the right treatment and I could get on with my life. It did come back as periodic paralysis with paramyotonia, which we suspected there was myotonia involved in some way. The biggest news is that it's not hypo, it's hyper. And so for the last 12 years, I've been living as a hypo and not a hyper, and it explains a lot. The weirdest part is, because I know a lot of people are going to say, well, isn't it obvious that you would have been hypo or hyper over hypo? So the weird thing is that on my blood work, my potassium was never high. It was always either normal or low. The other confusing part is that I have a sensitivity to gluten, which when I would eat carbs that contained gluten, I would get sick, and I thought it was because of the reaction to the carb, not the gluten. But a few years back, I did learn that I do have a gluten sensitivity, and now moving forward with my new confirmed diagnosis, I make sure that I stay away from gluten, and I do fine on carbs. The other interesting factor was the potassium did seem to help under certain circumstances. So to this day, the potassium still does help my daughter when she has the migraines. But the migraines may not be associated with periodic paralysis at all. It may just be that she's someone who suffers from migraines, and for whatever reason, the potassium does help her when she has these migraines.
So even on clinical grounds, it was thin ice to be calling this hypo-PP and giving potassium supplements. So after we did the science and we had a chance to talk this out with her whole family, I encouraged them to stop the potassium supplements and see what would happen. And I'm told they're feeling a lot better, and I look forward to the next PPA meeting when I can sit down with the whole family and we'll talk about this.
But yep, I changed my diet. I've gained weight because now I eat a lot of carbs, which I kind of struggle with, because I'm like, okay, I can be active if I eat my carbs, but the carbs put weight on me. So that's been, a little difficult to wrap my head around. But I've only had one episode since I've been diagnosed and started the treatment of hyperkalemic periodic paralysis. And it was the paramyotonia episode where I went into full body contractions. And then I have had a very mild episode in the last month, and I was able to completely control it with eating carbs, lots of carbs, doing my albuterol inhaler, and drinking lots of water. I feel great. My sister struggled with the diagnosis a little because, you've lived your life for a long time in a certain way. But she finally stopped taking all of her potassium, and she's doing much better. So yeah, it's been really crazy. But again, I wasn't surprised. I knew something wasn't right. So I wasn't surprised when it came back that it was hyper. Along the journey, a few things that made it that should have been key indicators that should have pointed directly to hyper, but because the awareness and that's why, we're trying so hard to spread awareness. One was my paramyotonia was a huge indicator that I did not have hypo. Myotonia, any kind of myotonia, paramyotonia, you won't have in hypo. And I have severe paramyotonia where my whole body will contract. So that should have been a huge red flag to doctors that this is not hypo. But we always focus on that blood level, and my blood level would go down. My potassium would go down if it shifted in any direction. It never shifted too high. 99% of the time, it stayed within normal limits, which is another indicator that Dr. Cannon talks about. If your normal potassium levels, you're probably hyper and not necessarily hypo. And that was a huge other indicator that should have pointed us in the right direction.
So this is one example where, going the extra mile, thinking carefully about how to understand whether a variant is significant and work it out, I think is going to pay off. It's also interesting because her family, part of the unusual feature is they are carriers for a risk factor of myotonia congenita. So that's a chloride channel problem. Separate disease. It has the myotonia, the muscle stiffness, but not episodes of weakness. So it turns out the variant she has in the sodium channel, that the gene testing companies didn't want to call it an abnormality. One of the reasons is it's fairly common. 1 in 1,000 people has this variant. Well, 1 in 1,000 people do not have periodic paralysis, right? So it didn't match up, and so that's why it was unknown significance. What we think is going on, it's a double hit. They have this variant that if you just have one copy, you're going to be okay. You tolerate that. But when you combine that in her family with being a carrier for this chloride mutation that causes myotonia, you put the two together and you have dramatic symptoms. And that's what's happening in her. So this is actually the first example of a sodium channel mutation that actually causes a syndrome if you will, in the family, because they have to have a second hit. If you have this alone, this variant of the sodium channel alone, you will not have symptoms. So we're excited about it. We're doing a little bit more analysis, making sure everything is a solid story, and we'll publish this in a medical journal.
So the one thing that Dr. Cannon found out first was he was able to prove that it is a form of periodic paralysis, and he was able to prove the type of periodic paralysis. I think a lot of people get stuck on the type. I think I have, or my doctor thinks I have. And until you have a genetic diagnosis, you have to be careful, with that I'm living proof of that.
If you would like to know more about periodic paralysis, visit periodicparalysis.org. And if you enjoyed this video and want more, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and hit that bell so you don't miss any future videos. It really does help spread the word. You can view other videos about periodic paralysis by clicking the thumbnails to the right. If you have questions, just leave a comment below or reach out to us on social media. We'd love to hear from you.